elements of memory, love, regret, and longing that quietly live in their streets and neighborhoods. Someone once wrote, a city is not made of its 7 or 70 wonders, but of the answers it gives to our questions. And perhaps today we will discover what Delhi whispers when we listen closely. And who better to hear it from people who have spent their lives living in Delhi, loving it, and probably loathing it. Right? And we are delighted to welcome for this session Amitabha Bagchi and Sameer Sandhir. Amitabha Bagchi is an acclaimed Indian novelist and academic whose work explores the intersections of memory, history, and changing social landscapes of modern India. And Sameer is an avid reader and a thoughtful conversationalist who enjoys moderating author discussions at literature festivals, creating spaces where conversations around books remain engaging, accessible, and reflective. So, this stage is all yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the second edition of the Nainital Literature Festival. I would like to thank Amitabh for hosting this wonderful session, this festival, and also an honorable mention to Pashu and Abhyuday, without whose support I don't think Amitabh would have been able to carry this forward. So I'm in conversation with, as she introduced, with Amitabha Bagchi, and I would like to get straight into the book because we have less time today and everything has got late and the weather is very unpredictable. So this title, The Unknown City, the title of your book, it's a very evocative title. So, and when I was reading this book, I wanted to know, is this about a city or is it about people? What is the title about?
So, this book, Unknown City, it's kind of, you can say, some people call it a jump sequel. It carries forward the story of Arindam Chatterjee, who was the protagonist of my first book, Above Average. In Above Average, we saw him in college, which was IIT, and sort of making a mess of it, trying to figure out who he was. Subsequently, Arindam Chatterjee graduated from IIT. He went to do his PhD in the US, where he also, like his ambitions of being a writer were things that he was pursuing at that time. And of course, at that time, he gets involved with, with various women. And what he realizes is that, one part of the IIT story which is not talked about is that it used to be, less so now, a very male space. A space in which men are deprived of certain basic interactions which help them grow in a particular way. So as I was writing this book about Arindam's relationships with women, the mistakes he made, and his later reflection on what he did or did not understand when he was doing this, a particular share of Parveen Shakir was in my mind. Parveen Shakir is a Pakistani 20th century poet whom I love dearly. And she said, "Raston ka ilm tha na humko na samton ki khabar, shehre na maloom ki chahat magar karte rahe," which means that I didn't know what was where, I didn't know where the roads led to, but I still wanted it, this unknown city. And that in this, when I thought of Arindam's struggles, to find love, to be seen, and to be something, to be there for someone, I realized that relationships across this gender line, I mean, today even the notion of gender is so complicated, have this notion of this, wanting, there's a fascination, there's a desire, but there is this lack of understanding, this lack of knowledge, that men don't understand what women are thinking, women don't necessarily fully understand what it is that men want. And so this, the idea that the heart is an unknown city was, that's how this book's title came. So yeah, that's...
So the heart is basically the unknown city.
You can say, or for Arindam, the world of women is an unknown city. Or for us, our desires, they take us into this unknown space. I mean, see, because it's based on a piece of poetry, so I don't like the idea of collapsing it down to just one meaning. It has many aspects.
It has many aspects.
Yeah.
Right. Would you like to do some small readings?
Yeah, sure, certainly. I think for fiction, probably the best way of getting into it is just reading. You can talk about it a lot, but that doesn't really help. So, also, we talked about Delhi and so on. So there are a number of two or three different cities in this book. Delhi is one of them. And this passage deals with that. So Arindam, the first half of this book is about Arindam's relationship with Supriya. Supriya is someone very much like Arindam. She had a government servant father, grew up in Delhi, not a Hindi speaker. But Arindam went to IIT, she went to JNU, and they had been in school together, and at some point, they kind of meet a little later. And anyway, from here, we had been through all the displays. The Amrita Shergills that were voluptuous but approachable, the Jamini Roys that were earthy but nonetheless evoked awe with their geometric discipline, the soothing beauty of Gaganendranath Tagore's watercolors, and on and on. I was overwhelmed, floating in a world of colors and textures, looking for an exit into the outside where I could process all that I had seen. But Supriya gestured, shushing me, although I wasn't saying anything, and took me up a spiral staircase that Jaipur's kings and queens must have once used, into a musty corridor that, despite the old world stone flooring, was clearly a government office. At the end of the corridor, there was a half-open door through which I could see the file-laden desk of some kind of minor official. Supriya asked me to wait outside, swept into the office and engaged the master of the desk in what sounded like pleasantries for a couple of minutes. Then, emerging, took me by the hand in a sudden motion that sent a frisson of excitement through me and ushered me into a side room that I had assumed was locked. "Look, Rindu," she said, "this is the real stuff." As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw that there were rows and rows of canvases stacked vertically. She stepped up to one set and started leafing through them at light speed, reeling off one name after another. Raza, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Binod Bihari Mukherjee, Anjali Ela Menon. "Look, Rindu, look." Just the summer before that, I had visited the Met and the MoMA in New York, and in the years to come, I was to visit the grand museums of DC and London, not to mention the Louvre in Paris. But nothing has come close to the furtive, hurried, guilty, luminescent pleasure of those 5 minutes that I spent in that room, using whatever light had found its way through the cracks to look at some of the most beautiful achievements of 20th century Indian art with Supriya. "Why are we in a hurry? Didn't he allow you to come in here?" "No," she whispered. "I just went and asked him if Rishipal ji was still here. Rishipal has been transferred to the National Museum, but I needed an excuse to come to this floor, to bring you here." We ran down the stairs like school children, fleeing the playground after smashing a cantankerous neighbor's window. A perfect winter day lay waiting outside for us, cool and bright. We stood in front of the museum for a while, regaining our breath as we looked through the majestic grille work beyond which stood India Gate of shared ice cream memories. "I really feel like," she said, and before she could continue, I had broken in with "Chaat at Bengali market." She turned to me, eyes wide with surprise. Then her face softened and she said quietly, "You completed my sentence." From her voice, I could tell that she was falling in love with me even as she spoke. How happy I had been in that moment. Those 4 words, "Chaat at Bengali market," had sprung out of some deeper instinct, and I immediately interpreted my ability to guess what she was thinking as evidence of our deep connection. I ignored all of our many differences, lonely and desperate for love as I was, joyously coming to the conclusion that the success of my intuition indicated that our many commonalities linked us together tightly at the subterranean level where intuition does its work.
So your first book was Above Average.
Yeah.
I think it was in 2007.
7 years.
And this has come out in 2025.
25, yeah.
I think they're sequels.
Yeah.
So does one need to read Above Average to get a grasp of this book, or we can read it independently?
So it's difficult to answer that question, because if I say you need to read the one, maybe you'll buy both, and if I say you don't, then at least you'll buy this one. I think that
I read the book just so I think it was okay alone also.
Yeah, I think I don't see a problem. Actually, my wife she's a novelist, Ratika, and she finger wagged me a lot that it has to be stand independently. I think it does stand independently, but there's a bigger point here. That when we present a character in fiction or present some situations in fiction, we have to give it some depth, right? And the question is, how much depth? Do we go all the way to their childhood? Do we go to their parents? Do we go to their great grandparents, etc.? And I think fiction works best when that decision about depth is taken in an appropriate way. Understanding that with more depth, you will get a different view of the character.
So is it possible that they are somewhat related to you, or some of them, those experiences are your experiences?
So this book falls in the genre of what is called autofiction, where the main character shares, shares aspect of the author's own life. And Above Average was similar to that. And autofiction also has this aspect of that typically the main character is kind of, their struggle to become a writer is part of it. So in that sense, this is very much a work of autofiction. And yes, definitely there are aspects of my own life. Let me put it in a different way, right? I think the fact that it's based on real life, etc., is not so interesting. I have generally lived a pretty boring life, and I'm very happy about that. But I think it's more like this, that when you are trying to write fiction, you need to understand what makes a character. You need to be able to imagine a person. And I was about to say person in full, but it's impossible to imagine a person in full. You need to imagine enough of a person to be able to bring them onto the page in a way which makes sense to people. When I was writing Above Average, I worked from people I knew, and I made characters out of them. And that was a really learning experience. Because I didn't have to imagine them from scratch. I took some raw material and I converted that raw material to a character. Then I wrote like 3 other novels in which I felt, okay, I know how to make characters now, so I made characters. But I always got this question, like, from others and from myself, that are my women characters real enough? Are they well realized enough? And at least in my mind, the answer was not enough, not enough. Other people also said it. So, people who weren't polite enough to make me feel good about having made a mistake. So, and at some point in my life, a few years ago, I realized that, okay, you know what, the process of writing a fully realized woman character, this is something I really now need to take the next step towards it. So in some sense, I fell back on that initial process which I had applied in Above Average, where I decided to look at the women that I had known more closely than any other women that I had known, and create characters which were loosely based on them, with the idea that if I can't understand people whom I have known that closely, if I can't identify the gaps in my understanding, how will I ever create a woman character who is real? Right? So that is kind of, I hope that's sort of an answer to this question. That yes, it was based on my real life, but there was a purpose for that. It's not the purpose was not to tell some stories to people who might find them interesting because they know those people. The purpose was to understand, go into the mind of a female character.
So the love affairs were not yours.
Well, a lot of my friends, one or two of my friends wrote to me saying, Bagchi, you never told us about all these things. I'm like, that's not the point, man. We are all 50 now, all that's not relevant.
So one thing, while reading the book, another thing I noted was that Arindam is older in this book. Right?
Yeah.
And he's looking back at his relationships.
Yeah.
And when he's looking back, he realizes that he's messed up. You know?
Yeah.
And does that actually happen in real life also, that you understand relationships later in hindsight?
I think that in some sense, there are 2 effects that I think came together in the writing of this book. One is the stage of life. You get to a certain stage of life where you feel that some of the emotional stuff that you have not fully navigated from your past needs to be navigated. That's one aspect, and this for me particularly came along with the pandemic, which also gave you a lot of time. As a writer, you're always trying to engage with the world, right? But I think when the pandemic happened, it was also the time when we realized that the transformation of India as a nation into something unrecognizable and ugly was very complete. So my previous book, Half the Night Is Gone, had very much dealt with the nation and how it thinks about religiosity and all. But in 2020, I found that I couldn't deal with the world outside. So I went in and I started asking these questions about my past. So it was also, so I think these two things came together. Now, whether doing that is productive or not, I don't know. I think there are a lot of people who just get through life with denial, and I salute them. I wish I was one of them, because they seem to have it much easier. But at the same time, I think that there's something to be said for leading an examined life also. I mean, I hope there's something to be said for it.
So yeah, I mean, that answers the question, I guess. Thank you. And also, I noted that the women in your book, they are more intelligent than the protagonist, that is Arindam. I mean, they were more emotionally invested in him, and he was kind of, on the surface kind of thing, main hoon ki nahi hoon. So
right.
Was it conscious to make the women more emotionally, solid than the main character?
Yeah, so
They were more intelligent, you could say.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Instead of answering this question directly, what I'll do is I'll read a little bit. So Arindam spent some years in the US, and in his last year in the US, he moves to New York, and there he meets Razia. Right, and basically Razia is someone who's about his own age. He's getting to 30 at this time, and she's from a very conservative Muslim family, but wants to be a writer. She's lived a life as a bohemian for many years, and basically has come in contact with Arindam through her sister. For Razia, who was the child of very conservative parents and had grown up in a hardscrabble neighborhood filled with justified anger at the injustices that people like her had dealt with, or that she had herself dealt with, the racism, the sexual molestation, writing was a way to express that anger, and most importantly, for her to create space for solidarity, understanding, and healing for the young people who would read her work. I too, like most serious novelists, felt that there was something wrong with the world, and I was looking to critique it in the novel whose first draft I had completed just weeks before moving to Brooklyn. But I was painfully aware that being male and upper caste, having grown up in a metropolis like Delhi with an English education and a spot in an IIT, I belonged squarely to a privileged group. If I wanted to grow as a writer, I would first have to accept this fact and then take on the role of an internal critic of my privileged group instead of trying to speak for oppressed people whose reality I had no experience of. I felt that I had made some progress down that road with my novel, which tried to show how ambition damaged young men in India. This book was to be generally misunderstood. Do all writers think that their books are not understood? First, for example, in the US, by an agent who, having had success with a writer who had written up Arranged Marriage in Beach Street for an American audience, wondered why the whole exciting new story of bright young middle-class Indians leading technological progress in America was missing from it. And then in India, after publication, because everyone thought I was trying to ride the bandwagon inaugurated by one of my seniors from college, who had decided to encash the glamour associated with IIT and write a mass market paperback that propelled him to public prominence and made him into what we would now call an influencer. If I were to be completely honest, a good portion of the blame for these misunderstandings lay with me. While I was fairly clear about what I wanted to achieve artistically, I had only abstract ideas of how the book might be received. Almost 8 years had passed since the early training with Steve and David in 96-97, the last 4 of which I had spent writing this novel. In these 8 years, I had evolved some fairly clear ideas about the kind of sentences I did or did not want to write, and the kind of worlds I wanted or did not want to create with such sentences. But all the notions of the effect this writing would have on a reader, and if it made it to a reader's hands, were vague. For Razia, on the other hand, writing was a form of activism, a potentially potent form, and therefore she was happy to laugh off issues of craft and style. She could write poetry that felt like prose one day and prose that felt like poetry the next day. For 3 years I thought this was a short story, but now it turns out it was a poem all along. I just didn't see it. Slap a bunch of short stories together, call it a novel, and other such things that were anathema to me. Possibly because I was straitjacketed in my thinking, although I was too polite to actually say so out loud to her. What was common to both of us was that we were happy to claim the tag writer without having published anything significant. The difference being that I didn't make the claim myself, instead hoping that other people would call me a writer as I blushed modestly, while she was happy to proclaim her writerhood from rooftops, something she literally did on one memorable occasion. But perhaps I'm thinking now that this was justified, because at that time all I wanted was to be published in New York and take that cultural capital back with me to New Delhi, whereas Razia wanted something very different. Razia wanted to change the world. So I think this passage speaks a little bit to your question, that in retrospect, Arindam realizes that there was a kind of shallowness, a kind of callowness that he had in his 20s or early 30s, whereas the women in his life had already had kind of experiences which had made them somehow more mature. And that he didn't necessarily realize that. Of course, you can ask the question that how would a callow young man in his 20s realize that callowness is the problem? How could he, fast forward this? I think one of the big problems in the world today, in many sort of elite cultures, is that men take a very long time to grow up. Very long time to grow up. Right, and most women, like in a place like the US, no woman would date a man in his 20s and expect it to go anywhere, because men in their 20s are basically children, right? I mean, those of you who are not yet there and making notes, please, make notes. And I mean, look, I don't mean to be like that. So that it's actually an examination of masculinity. The book is also an examination of masculinity, and the challenge that female maturity poses to masculinity.
Yeah, because he does appear childish a lot.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of humor also in the book, if you guys want to. I don't know where, it's very quite humorous.
Thanks.
The sense of humor is quite good.
Thank you.
And there are a lot of cities in this book.
Yeah.
Known cities, obviously about the heart and a lot of other aspects. But actually there are a couple of cities, not couple, 3-4 cities which Arindam lives in, So would you like to talk a bit about the cities?
Yeah, so for me, I think place has always been very important. And I think that, in fact, when I was writing this book, in some sense, this was the one book in which I consciously moved the idea of setting out of my head and started writing it more organize it around these particular relationships that Arindam has with these different women. But somehow the place always comes into the conversation, because different cities, different places have a different kind of temper, and they work through our minds and our sensibilities in different ways. So like, for example, like I said, in the end of the book, Arindam is in New York and he meets this Razia. You would not meet someone like Razia in any place apart from New York. And living in New York does pose that kind of challenge to you, that how do you deal with such people? Whereas on the other hand, he spends a couple of years in California where he meets Lisa, who is, she's a kind of a middle-class person with a job, who's an activist, but she's also depressed. She, comes from a working-class family, which is dysfunctional. And he wants to connect with her, but his own sort of elite background, although he's from a government officer's family, but he belongs to a cultural elite of sorts and gone to IIT. Like at one point he talks about he goes to visit Lisa at her parents' house, and her parents live in a small town which is in near the Carmel and this area, Monterey. So Monterey is just south of the Bay Area. And her father was like a mechanic, and her mother was a secretary in a doctor's office, right? And as he's turning off the exit to go to the small town where they live, he thinks of his friends from IIT, many of whom are either doing very good. Some of them have already become Silicon Valley millionaires who would pass by this exit without ever stopping, right, and would wonder what it is that he was looking for in going off this exit. So in that sense, that it's that area, Monterey, Carmel, it's a kind of refuge of small town America, which is just on the border. Like at one point Lisa says that, we used to feel bad for people who lived in San Jose, now you can't afford a house there. So it's, the history of places, and Arindam sort of moving through these different spaces, not fully understanding what they mean, but still kind of desiring some connection with those places. That is definitely, it became part of this book, although I had not first thought that that's what this is about. So yeah, I think that openness to what a place means, and what its history is, what its culture is, and what it does to its people, is always been a part of my writing, and it's there here to some extent as well.
So, for the last question of the session, can you just lead us into your journey as a writer, from when you started and how you started and how you have reached, and how is it going for you, and what is your future project, or what would you like to do, or what is in your mind?
So yeah, I think let me put it this way, that I started, my first novel was Above Average, but that's not where I started. In the 90s, when I graduated from college, it was this kind of period where Arundhati Roy had just won a Booker Prize, and there was a certain kind of prose and certain way of thinking that was very much thought as part of Indian writing in English, and was getting a lot of praise. And people like Vikram Seth, Salman Rushdie and all, I didn't like any of that stuff. I just felt that they had it all completely wrong. Of course, at that time I also read a quote by Martin Amis, who said that to be a writer you have to believe that all your contemporaries are slugs in the mud who don't have any idea what one should be doing. So I took my opinions with a pinch of salt, and then I somehow I was very influenced in a way by this one Shyam Benegal movie called Summer. So Shyam Benegal in his early career made all these movies about caste violence and all that. In Summer he makes a movie about a film crew making a movie about caste violence, and realizing that those ways of thinking are there in them also, although they feel they're very progressive and they're trying to change the world. So all this pushed me towards, and of course, Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, where there are a few sections about like middle class life in Calcutta, and these big sections about people going to England and colonialism and whatnot. I found those parts tedious, but those few sections which had to do with the middle class boy, that was what was interesting. So I was very much focused on that's where I need to go. And my reading of Hindi literature at that time was also pushing me in that direction. So I spent quite some time dealing with that stuff. I wrote that book Above Average, then I wrote this book called The Householder, which was just a tribute to Srilal Shukla in many ways. And then of course I left the US at that time and I was feeling very bereft. So I wrote this book called This Place, which was about Baltimore, but also about America in general, and was very much inspired by, you can say, Edward Hopper, who's sort of, I mean, if you haven't seen Edward Hopper's paintings, I think just looking at Edward Hopper's paintings is the best way to understand America. All these other discussions go on. Um, and then, and all this time I'd been reading all this Urdu poetry and whatnot, and all that came out in this one novel called Half the Night Is Gone, which took me sort of further into the like Indian tradition, but also further into what I realized was a primary interest of mine, that family relationships and stuff like that. So that's kind of, it has been a journey in which I think I'm not very good at repeating myself. Like I find I don't mind my previous work, but I find it boring to do the same thing again. So that makes it a challenge. But currently, I'm working on the novel that I was working on before I started writing this, which has it's centered around one female protagonist. So I'm excited about that, but also a little scared because I've crossed the line that I've been wanting to cross for a long time, and I feel I'm feeling, but then Naipaul said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that when you start a book, you always start with some kind of little bit of a germ of an idea, and you just follow it, and then you hope it will lead you somewhere. Now, obviously, sometimes it's going to lead you to blunders, and sometimes it's going to lead you to better places. So let's hope this time it's a better place.
Much. And I'd like to open the floor to questions. If anyone has questions for Sir, he can just, have a word with him. Or we can take it up later. You can take it up later with him. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
It's not directly related to this present novel of yours. What I was wondering is that when you start writing a novel, do you have a fixed number of characters that you're going to put in it? And do you have them characterized beforehand that they are going to behave in this manner and that manner? Or along the way when you're writing that novel, you develop an affinity to one particular character and you give it more importance, or you change the very persona of the character as you go along writing the...
Yeah, I think all the options that you have listed out, I think different writers have had different experiences, and I'm sure they've had all those experiences. In my case, typically, there's been one character which has compelled me, and then from there, their world has to be fleshed out. So other characters came. But in the current work, like I thought I was compelled by one character, then I brought in another character, and then it became her story rather than the first one story. So I think that writing a novel, I mean, like in literary fiction type stuff, is it's a world making process, and actually for me it's like the process is very important, because till I finish that book, I'm living in that world every day. So I people that world in such a way that the time that I spend in that world gives me something. It answers some questions that are in my mind which I don't even know that they are there. So like Munir Niazi says कि सवाल का जवाब भी सवाल में मिला मुझे, right? So that's how these different people, characters emerge, their stories diversify, and so on. I think I have too many characters in my books. Then it's not too many for me, but I mean, like someone said that in Half the Night Is Gone there were like 100 characters, and I mean actually they were wrong. They're only about 90 something because I have a spreadsheet and I know, right?
Didn't feel that. It felt well populated, like a little boss shield, like
Little Boston.
lots of action, but it wasn't as though you could pick out characters and knock them off. Whatever they be. So is plotting an important part of your journey? Like, do you have an arc for your main character?
I try to, but I try to keep it a little open. The big arc, I try to keep it a little open, because if you try to arc too soon, then you get stuck with you get bought into a particular arc, and then that causes problems. And also the open-ended, in Half the Night Is Gone, I got a lot of people are like, "Arey, you didn't end it." I was like, come on, man. I mean, खुद end कर लो. अरे सब कुछ मुझे ही करना है क्या?
So on that note, we'll call it the end of the session. A very nice session, and thank you so much for.
Thanks so much, Sameer. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Yeah. Absolutely. Thanks a lot. हाँ, बैठिए.
A wonderful session, and thank you, Sameer and Amitabha, for such interesting conversation. And I really look forward to reading Unknown City. And all the book lovers here, do grab your copy of the book, and you can also meet the author and get it signed.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And may I now request Anirudh Gupta ji.
Thanks, man.
Classmates. Three classmates.
Yes, exactly. Oh, sorry. Yeah.